Imagine hearing a cough in the next room and thinking the dead are hungry, not sick, not unlucky, hungry. That sounds like a campfire story until you learn that real families in New England once opened real graves because they believed someone they loved was feeding on the living. What would you do if every doctor failed, every prayer failed, and the same disease kept taking one person after another from the same house? In the 1800s, that disease had a soft name: consumption. It made bodies waste away slowly, as if something invisible were drinking the strength out of them. Your cheeks hollowed, your skin paled, you coughed blood. You grew weaker in front of people who could do almost nothing except watch. Today, you know it as tuberculosis. But before germ theory became ordinary knowledge, consumption did not feel like a microbe. It felt personal. It felt targeted. It felt like a curse moving through a family room by room. And when a sickness seems to choose one household, your brain looks for a face. Sometimes that face was buried in the family cemetery. The vampire panic that actually happened was not proof that vampires were real. It was proof that fear can become a medical theory when science has not reached the kitchen table yet. And the strangest part is that the people involved were trying to survive. One famous case happened in Exeter, Rhode Island, in 1892. The Brown family had already been broken by consumption. George Brown lost his wife, Mary Eliza, in 1883. Then he lost his daughter, Mary Olive, in 1884. Years later, his son Edwin became sick too, and his daughter, Mercy Lena Brown, died in January 1892. What would that look like from inside one farmhouse? It would not look like a legend. It would look like laundry that stayed unfinished. It would look like a chair nobody sat in anymore. It would look like a father counting graves instead of birthdays. Neighbors began to suspect that one of the dead Browns was not fully at rest. The belief was not the elegant vampire myth from movies. There was no cape, no castle, no charming stranger at the window. In New England folk belief, the suspected vampire was often a dead relative who was somehow draining life from the surviving sick. So, on March the 17th, 1892, people went to the Brown family graveyard. George Brown reportedly did not believe the vampire theory, but he allowed the exhumation. Mary Eliza and Mary Olive had decomposed. Mercy was different. She had been kept in a cold above-ground crypt during winter, so her body was much better preserved than the others. To frightened neighbors, that natural preservation looked like a sign. Do you see the trap? Science sees cold temperatures slowing decay. Fear sees a body that has not finished dying. Mercy's heart and liver were removed. Her heart was burned. According to accounts of the incident, the ashes were mixed into medicine for Edwin to drink, hoping to break the influence of the dead. Edwin still died a few months later. That is the real horror of the story. The ritual did not save him. It only showed how desperate everyone had become, and Mercy Brown was not alone. Folklorist Michael E. Bell later documented New England vampire cases in his research and in Food for the Dead, tracing a pattern of families exhuming bodies during waves of consumption. George R. Stetson had already written about the belief in 1896 in The Animistic Vampire in New England, treating it as a folk practice that had survived in rural communities. Even Henry David Thoreau noted a Vermont case in his journal in 1859 where a heart was burned after a family feared the dead were harming the living. Why would this happen in New England, a place people imagine as stern, church-going, and practical? Because practical people still panic when the explanation is missing. Consumption was terrifying because it moved slowly and intimately. It often spread through households because tuberculosis passes through the air in close living conditions. But before people understood that clearly, the pattern looked supernatural. One person died, then another, then another. The living slept in the same rooms, breathed the same air, cared for the sick, and then blamed the grave. In 1882, Robert Koch announced that he had identified the bacterium that causes tuberculosis. That discovery changed medicine. But discoveries do not instantly travel into every rural home, every churchyard, and every frightened conversation at midnight. Knowledge spreads unevenly. Folk belief fills the gaps faster. So the vampire panic survived beside modern medicine. That is what makes it feel so unsettling. The 19th century had newspapers, trains, doctors, and microscopes. It also had families burning hearts. The story gets older when you cross the Atlantic. In 1725, in the Serbian village of Kisilova, Petar Blagojevich died. After his death, several villagers also died in a short period, and local people believed Blagojevich had returned from the grave. An Austrian official, Ernst Frombold, wrote a report after villagers demanded action. The document exists. What it means is still interpreted through folklore, panic, and early modern ideas about death. A few years later, another Serbian case became famous. Arnold Paule, sometimes recorded as Arnaut Pavle, was said to have died after claiming he had once been troubled by a vampire. In the early 1730s, after more deaths in the village of Medveja, Austrian military surgeon Johann Flückiger investigated. His report, Visum et Repertum, described exhumations and bodies that locals believed showed signs of vampirism. Again, the document exists. The vampire does not have to. What frightened people saw in those graves can often be explained by ordinary decomposition. Bodies can bloat, fluids can move, skin can retract, making hair and nails appear longer. Blood-like liquid can appear at the mouth. A corpse can look disturbingly active, even when nothing supernatural is happening. But imagine seeing that without forensic science. Would you calmly explain tissue changes, or would you remember the neighbor who died last week? This is how folklore becomes believable. It does not begin with stupidity. It begins with pattern recognition under stress. Your brain is built to connect dots, especially when the cost of missing danger feels higher than the cost of being wrong. If the dead might be killing the living, then opening a grave can feel less like superstition and more like emergency medicine. That does not make it true. It makes it human. The vampire panic shows how folklore adapts to whatever a culture fears most. In Eastern Europe, vampire reports grew in a world of borderlands, war, empire, and village rumour. In New England, the fear attached itself to consumption, family death, and the silence of rural cemeteries. The monster changed shape, but the emotional engine stayed the same. Something is taking people. Someone must be responsible. The dead are close enough to blame. By the time Bram Stoker published Dracula in 1897, the vampire had become literary, aristocratic, and theatrical. But the older panic was rougher and sadder. It was not about immortality. It was about a parent watching a child disappear by inches. It was about communities turning grief into action because doing nothing felt unbearable. That is why this folklore was true in the only way folklore can be true without being factual. The vampire was not real. The fear was real. The graves were real. The burned hearts were real. The disease was real, and the human need for an explanation was painfully real. Today, the same pattern has not vanished. It just wears cleaner clothes. When something invisible spreads, people still search for hidden causes, secret enemies, and one shocking answer that makes chaos feel organized. You may not fear a dead relative in the cemetery, but your brain still hates uncertainty. So, the next time a strange story feels too ridiculous for anyone to believe, remember the cough in the next room. Not because the dead were hungry, because the living were terrified.
If your brain enjoyed this, do all three. Hit subscribe, smash like, and turn notifications on so you can watch next.